Words can be shields, but they can also be the very weapons used to distort reality, especially within the complex, painful dynamics of toxic and abusive relationships. When we hear a sentence like, "I did not punch you, I was hitting you," our initial reaction might be confusion, disbelief, or even a sense of intellectual whiplash, but as public health professionals and behavioral experts, we recognize this as a profound, textbook example of minimizing behavior, semantic manipulation, and psychological control. Today, we are going to dive deep into the anatomy of relationship toxicity, the psychological mechanisms behind domestic abuse, and the ways in which language is weaponized to alter a victim's perception of reality. This is not just a breakdown of a high-profile audio recording that gripped the world. It is a comprehensive, scientific exploration of interpersonal violence, accountability, and the subtle, often invisible red flags that signal a relationship has turned hazardous to one's mental and physical health. To understand why a statement like this is so damaging, we have to look at the psychological concept of minimization, which occurs when an individual acknowledges that an event took place but attempts to downplay its severity, impact, or moral implications to avoid accountability and maintain dominance. By drawing a bizarre, arbitrary distinction between punching and hitting, the speaker is attempting to rewrite the narrative of physical aggression, suggesting that because the action did not meet a specific, self-defined threshold of violence, it should not be categorized as abuse or taken seriously. This tactic is incredibly insidious because it targets the victim's cognitive processing, forcing them to argue about the definition of words rather than focusing on the core issue, which is the violation of their physical safety and boundaries. In the realm of behavioral health, we classify this as a form of gaslighting, a manipulative tactic where a person seeks to sow seeds of doubt in a targeted individual or in members of a general audience, making them question their own memory, perception, and sanity. When a perpetrator of violence insists that your lived experience of being struck is being exaggerated because of the specific mechanics of the blow, they are actively trying to dismantle your trust in your own senses. This creates a state of cognitive dissonance, where the victim is trapped between what they know happened, experiencing physical pain and fear, and what they are being told happened, which is that the incident was minor, normal, or mischaracterized. Over time, this erosion of reality leaves a victim entirely dependent on the abuser's version of events, making it nearly impossible to seek help or recognize the true extent of the danger they are in. As we examine the dynamics of high-conflict relationships, it is crucial to recognize that physical violence rarely occurs in a vacuum. It is almost always preceded and accompanied by severe emotional and psychological abuse, isolation, and coercive control. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior used by an abuser to strip a person of their autonomy, freedom, and sense of self, utilizing tools ranging from financial restriction and surveillance to emotional blackmail and verbal degradation. In public health, we view domestic abuse through an ecological model, understanding that individual behaviors are deeply intertwined with interpersonal relationships, community structures, and broader societal norms. When we look at relationships characterized by explosive arguments and mutual allegations of violence, the water becomes muddy, leading many observers to mistakenly dismiss the situation as mere mutual combat or a toxic match where both partners are equally to blame. However, forensic psychologists and domestic violence experts caution against the blanket use of the term mutual combat, because it often obscures the primary aggressor, the individual who holds the systemic power and control in the relationship and whose violence is used to dominate, rather than to defend or survive. In many highly volatile partnerships, what looks like mutual violence is actually a combination of primary aggression from one partner and reactive violence from the other, where the victim eventually snaps, retaliates, or fights back after prolonged periods of abuse. Distinguishing between primary aggression and reactive violence requires a meticulous look at the history of the relationship, the balance of power, who fears whom, and who suffers the systemic consequences of the control. When an individual uses semantic arguments during an active confrontation, saying they were hitting rather than punching, they're also engaging in a defense mechanism known as rationalization, manufacturing reassuring cliches or justifications to explain away behaviors that would otherwise be universally condemned. This allows the individual to protect their own ego and self-image, convincing themselves that they are not an abuser, that they are simply a passionate, flawed, or reactive partner who was pushed to their limits. This brings us to another critical concept in relational psychology, the cycle of abuse, originally formulated by Lenore Walker, which breaks down the predictable patterns found in abusive dynamics into distinct phases. The cycle typically begins with the tension-building phase, where stress, minor conflicts, and communication breakdowns cause an atmosphere of walking on eggshells, followed by the acute battering incident, where the physical, sexual, or severe emotional abuse occurs. After the explosion comes the reconciliation or honeymoon phase, where the abuser may express remorse, offer gifts, or conversely, minimize the behavior and blame the victim, promising that it will never happen again, before entering a period of calm that inevitably builds back into tension. The phrase we are analyzing belongs squarely to the transition between the acute incident and the manipulation of the reconciliation phase, where the reality of the violence is negotiated and minimized to keep the cycle spinning. For a general audience, understanding these phases is vital because it explains why people stay in toxic environments. The presence of the calm and honeymoon periods creates a powerful intermittent reinforcement schedule, which is the exact same psychological mechanism that makes gambling so addictive. The human brain is wired to hold on to hope, and when an abuser shows glimpses of warmth, remorse, or even just a calmer demeanor, the victim's brain interprets this as a sign that the relationship can be saved and that the abusive behavior is just an anomaly, rather than a systemic pattern. This chemical and psychological bonding to an abuser is often referred to as a trauma bond, a strong emotional attachment that develops between a victim and their abuser as a result of repeated, cyclical patterns of abuse punctuated by intermittent rewards. Breaking a trauma bond is one of the most difficult challenges in mental health recovery, requiring extensive therapy, community support, and a complete re-education on what constitutes safety and love. When we look at how to identify these toxic patterns in our own lives or the lives of those we care about, we must look for the subtle shifts in communication that occur long before physical violence ever manifests. Healthy communication is built on a foundation of mutual respect, active listening, validation, and a shared commitment to accountability, whereas toxic communication is characterized by defensiveness, stonewalling, contempt, and criticism, behaviors that renowned relationship expert Dr. John Gottman refers to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. When these 4 behaviors become chronic, they predict the demise of a relationship with stunning accuracy, but more importantly, they create a fertile breeding ground for psychological abuse. Contempt, in particular, which involves speaking down to a partner, using sarcasm, mocking them, or displaying hostile body language like eye-rolling, is the most destructive of these behaviors because it conveys a fundamental lack of respect and a belief that the partner is inferior. When contempt is normalized, it becomes much easier for a partner to justify physical aggression, because they have already dehumanized their significant other in their own mind. This is why we must never overlook verbal abuse or treat it as something that can just be brushed off. It is the structural framework upon which physical violence is constructed. To effectively navigate out of these destructive dynamics, individuals must first learn what not to do when faced with semantic manipulation and gaslighting. It is incredibly tempting to engage in an ongoing, exhaustive debate with a toxic partner to prove your point, correct their memory, or force them to admit that they punched you instead of hit you, but experts warn that this is a dangerous trap. Engaging in debates over the semantics of abuse validates the abuser's premise that the severity of the act is up for discussion, and it drains the victim of the emotional energy required to establish safety and boundaries. You cannot reason someone out of a position they did not reason themselves into, and an abuser who is actively minimizing their behavior is not looking for truth, they are looking for compliance and victory. Therefore, trying to convince an abuser of their wrongdoing or waiting for an authentic, unmanipulated apology is often a futile endeavor that keeps you anchored to the source of your trauma. Instead, what you must do is pivot toward radical acceptance of the reality you experienced, trusting your own perception without needing their confirmation, and focusing entirely on safety planning and emotional disengagement. Safety planning is a structured, practical strategy used by public health agencies and domestic violence advocates to help individuals safely navigate away from volatile situations, recognizing that the period immediately surrounding a victim's attempt to leave is statistically the most dangerous time for severe violence. A comprehensive safety plan involves identifying safe spaces within the home where there are no weapons and easy exits, keeping a packed bag with essential documents, medication, and clothes at a trusted friend's house, establishing a code word with loved ones to signal imminent danger, and securing independent financial resources. Furthermore, seeking professional help from licensed mental health counselors, clinical psychologists, or local domestic violence advocates who specialize in relational trauma is non-negotiable for long-term healing. These professionals can help individuals untangle the profound cognitive confusion caused by gaslighting, rebuild their shattered self-esteem, and process the post-traumatic stress that frequently follows the termination of an abusive relationship. It is also essential for society to shift its perspective on domestic violence, moving away from asking the flawed question of why didn't they just leave, and instead asking why does the perpetrator choose to abuse, and how can our communities better support survivors? The stigma surrounding domestic abuse, particularly when it involves high conflict dynamics or male victims, often prevents individuals from coming forward, out of fear of being judged, disbelieved, or mocked by a culture that prefers clean, simple narratives over complex human realities. By examining these high-profile recordings through a clinical, objective lens, we can demystify the mechanics of psychological warfare, empower individuals to recognize the early signs of control, and foster a more empathetic, informed society capable of breaking the cycle of violence for future generations. Recognizing that a statement like, "I was hitting you, not punching you," is a symptom of systemic manipulation can be the catalyst that allows someone to finally see the truth of their situation, step out of the fog of confusion, and reclaim their autonomy, their health, and their life. Relationships should be a sanctuary of peace, growth, and safety, and any linguistic or physical attempt to compromise that sanctuary must be met with clear boundaries, community intervention, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. If you found this information valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments what topic you want to see next.